was your weekend?
My weekend was really good. How was yours, sir?
Grand. Okay, we ready?
How would it expire? It's a new game.
Good morning, everybody. For our workshop for May 21st. Mr. Manager, we're going to talk about debt management.
Thank you.
Let's get started.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, council members. We had one workshop on this before. You asked for some additional time to think about it, and we've done some additional research, and Scott Sanders is about to run through the presentation for today. So I won't steal his thunder. Go ahead, Scott.
Good morning, Mayor, Council. Yes, this is a topic that we've already talked a little bit about back in March. So you will see a couple slides that have repeat information. Understandably, when it comes to government finance, there's some complexity there, and a couple times to discuss the same topics helps maybe to let it sink in a little bit. So with that, I'm going to jump right in. Essentially, the city already has a self-imposed limit on how much debt, general obligation debt, they can issue. The Constitution or the statutory limit is 5% of actual valuation, and our current valuation of a little over $11 billion allows the city of Des Moines to have nearly $560 million in GO debt. The city in recent years has reduced the CIP spending, which has allowed for an opportunity, if you will, with extra GO debt capacity. And that's really why I'm here this morning, is to ask for consideration of potentially using some of that capacity. So it's only about 64% of what the statutory limit is today, utilizing, you'll see there, about $360 million in actual debt. The city policy is also in front of you. With some help from Alan, we were able to go back and see what the prior actions were by the council to establish debt limits. And you'll notice that it's 80% of what the state allows, or another way of putting that is 4% of the total valuation calculation. But also within that city policy, you'll notice there is a statement to use revenue bonds for the enterprise funds. And when I say enterprise funds, I'm talking about sanitary sewer, storm sewer, and parking in particular. There'd be an opportunity, if necessary, for solid waste at some point too, but for right now, we're talking sanitary, storm, and parking. And so the current policy spells out to use revenue bonds as opposed to the GO. And that was written at a time when there wasn't any GO capacity available anyway. So it was kind of a non-issue, if you will. Whereas now, as I've mentioned, at 64% of the limit, there is an opportunity to potentially use GO debt. So I want to kind of get into why that might make sense. The future debt that we have planned in the CIP that would be paid by taxes and TIF will stay about that same 64-65%. What we're looking at in issuance is issuing slightly more than what we are retiring through principal payments. And so on a percentage of the valuation going up, we're able to keep the same 64-65% of utilization. And so again, that opportunity looks to be there out into the future as well. And as far as the utilities or the enterprise funds, they have needs to borrow every other year, starting with this year, 2014, and 2016. And when I came to you in March, I was probably trying to bite off a big piece of the apple by trying to resolve what I saw as 2016 issues. There was that last series of bonds could potentially take us over 80% if we were to issue all of those as GO. there's so many variables involved in discussions with the city manager's office. It makes more sense to just let's resolve the current issues, 2012, and get 2014 taken care of as well, and then let's see how it kind of plays out before we worry about the 2016 bond issues. And so what you're seeing is we've got about $64 million in borrowing needs from the parking, sanitary, and storm. That's equivalent to about 11.5% of the debt capacity. So you could add those two figures, the 65 and the 11.5, and see that we're still under the current policy of 80% without changing anything. The additional borrowing, as I mentioned, in 2016, we can take care of later. There'll be one of the main variables that's changing on us is the valuation number. And since our current valuation is for 2012, you know, there's at least 3, and maybe we'll know 4 more valuation dates before the 2016 even have to be issued. So there's a lot to play out yet as far as valuations, as well as we know legislative changes we'll want to keep an eye on between now and then as well. So this is a more focused policy change request, if you will, in that I'm proposing that you will consider allowing enterprise funds to utilize the GEO credit, which would impact interest rates. It would lower the interest rates. The GEO credit rating is, as we've talked about recently, a AAA with S&P and a AA1 with Moody's, whereas the utilities are 1 or 2 notches lower than that. And when you have a lower credit, that implies a higher interest rate and a higher, therefore, cost to borrow. The policy change does not impact the debt service levy, because I'm not talking about issuing any more debt that would be payable by taxes or TIF for that matter. We're focused on the enterprise funds, and we've had discussions throughout the budget season about the need for additional borrowing both for storm and sanitary. The parking I'll get into in a minute, that's actually a refunding. We're not looking at new money for parking at this time. So the excess capacity would remain at 20%, and that equates to over $110 million of additional borrowing that would be available at any point in time. And so it leaves quite a bit of cushion there for the unknown, if you will. And so the recommendation to utilize enterprise borrowings, there'd be a recommendation each time that there is an enterprise borrowing. And so we're looking at 2012, we need to get 1 issuance of parking, 1 issuance of sanitary sewer, and 1 issuance of storm taken care of. With each of those, what I'm proposing that's right in the policy change would be that the finance director bring to you a recommendation as to whether to issue those as revenue debt or as GEO debt, and then give you reasons why and what the impacts would be, whether it be savings on the interest costs, which would typically be the case, or whether it removes covenants that maybe are restrictive on the utilities that we want to get rid of. And lastly, some of the covenants you'll see involve additional coverage ratios where the revenues have to be higher than what's necessary to get the market comfortable with the borrowings when you're in a revenue bond situation. So the lower credit rating, as I mentioned, and the higher interest rates could be 25 to 50 basis points higher for the revenue debt. That is the equivalent of 1/4 to 0.5%. And then the dollar amounts could easily exceed $500,600,000. In fact, some of the numbers I've looked at are closer to $1 million per savings, depending on which utility you're dealing with and how much money needs to be issued at any given time. The covenants also include, on the revenue bond side, a requirement of reserve funds. And so what you're doing there is you're increasing the borrowing to be able to set aside some of the funds. And essentially those funds sit there earning 20 or 30 basis points, even though we had to pay 3%, or in some cases maybe even 4% for that debt. So there's this negative earnings that's there for the full life of the bonds, whether that be 10 years or in a lot of cases we need to issue 20-year debt. So for 20 years, you could be losing that access to funds, if you will.
So what will the reserve fund be then? What will be the requirement?
Typically, reserve funds are 10% of the borrowing amount, but there
if-
are a couple other opportunities to lower that slightly.
Okay.
There's a rule of 3 different variables. You can look at the average debt service annually, and if that's lower than the 10%, you can use that. So I'd be glad to go into that in more detail and show you some examples. But essentially, yeah, you're adding 10% more to the borrowing just to set the money aside to make the market happy, to make the market comfortable with the revenue bonds. And that gets to the heart, and maybe I'll back up just a step there. The revenue bonds are a lien against the utilities revenues. And that's where the market has to get comfortable with how much revenue are you producing in your sanitary sewer compared to your expenses. And so that's where the credit analysis is a pretty deep dive. You get into the discussions of, for instance, sanitary sewer. What's the weather been like? Because they're curious as how much water usage generates sewer fees. And so it's as compared to the GO credit, which is payable from taxes, the GO is a much easier credit for the market to get comfortable with. And because of that, the GO carries the lower interest rates. And so the more difficult an enterprise fund has had with its finances, where there's maybe peaks and valleys and unexpected costs, things of that nature, the more difficult the cash flow looks, the lower the credit rating, the higher the interest rates that it would cost for those borrowings. And if I had to put our utilities in order of struggling, right now our parking funds, as the economy has lessened and the vacancies in downtown, our parking fund has seen reduced revenues. And again, I'll dig into some more details there. So the parking is probably at most need of using a cheaper source of funds to borrow against. And then the sanitary sewer and then the storm is probably the healthiest with the highest coverage ratios today as we have it. So obviously the lower the debt service cost, because the interest rates being lower, it takes the pressure off of the user fees. Because every year we need to look at what those fees are anticipated to be. And if our debt service is able to stay lower, we're able to keep the fees lower as well. So this is a similar chart that I showed in March, but I broke it down a little further to show you the white line at the top is what the state limits the borrowing at. That's the 5% evaluation, 560 million roughly, is where that white line grows over time. And then the council imposed limit, 80% of that is the 4% that you see in yellow. And so starting from the bottom up, the purplish blue, if you will, on the bottom, is the debt that's being paid by the debt service levy. So that's where we have this $4 and some odd cents debt service levy that's on the property tax, part of our total property tax. And you'll see again how that is just very slightly going up over time, but it's only going up about the same rate as what the valuations are. So we're going to keep that steady on a percent basis, about that 65%. Then, excuse me, you need to add in the green as well to get to the 65%. The green is the TIF portion. And we have been issuing in fact, all our outstanding bond issues for TIF are now GO. There was a ruling 10 years ago that kind of set us in that motion. So even statewide, it's very rare to see a TIF revenue bond anymore. So those are all GO as well. Then what I've done then is add the utilities on top of that with the sanitary sewer in red, the storm in blue, and then the parking in that brown tannish. And the parking is just the one issuance for refunding that can be done at any point. The red sanitary, again, is a 2012, 14, and 16 layered in there, as well as the storm. There's 3 issuances, 2012, 2014, and 2016. And so relatively, how close are we to the current policy, that the yellow line, if you will? Again, we've got plenty of capacity immediately to issue the parking refund at any point, and then start to layer in at least the 2012 and the 2014 sanitary and storm, staying just below the yellow line. The concern would be out in the future that 2016 is getting really close to that 80%. We've got plenty of time to come back and talk to you about that, though. And again, I want to remind you that at any point that we go to issue debt, there would be a recommendation and an impact study that would tell you why it's maybe better or not better to utilize the GO credit rating. So I'm going to dive into the actual parking example. I've mentioned that the parking revenue has declined. The existing covenants require that we have nearly $2 million sitting in reserve for the bond issue that we do have. That was issued in 2000, by the way. The rates have to be sufficient to have an extra 25% of revenue above operating expenses, and that was under the 2000. The markets have changed quite a bit since 2000. I'm being told that it's likely if we were to go back out and issue parking revenue debt, given its history, the market would require 1.5 or 150% of what the annual expected payments would be. So it just puts pressure on higher revenue streams, which then is the user fee aspect on these utilities. The sanitary sewer and the storm, it's kind of questionable. The market might get comfortable with keeping those at 125, but it's not unlikely that depending on when the time comes to issuance, that we might be expected to keep even a higher on the sanitary and storm as well. In particular, the parking, whenever we have tax exempt, so this is not a revenue bond issue, but actually an exemption issue. When you have tax exempt debt to help pay for parking, then you have restrictions on how you can use those parking facilities. And that's considered a private activity restriction. And because of that, then, the solution we're proposing is to issue not parking revenue debt, but GO debt, and make the GO debt taxable, such that you can remove both the private activity and you can remove the need for the debt service reserve fund and the covenant requirements. So you're kind of getting the best of all worlds when you head to the GO taxable. Except in a typical market, when you hear GO taxable, you should be thinking, oh, that's probably high interest rates, right? Well, we actually proved that today's market, that's not the case. Just on last Wednesday, we were able to sell 10-year taxable debt at 1.5% interest rate. So there is a lot of room to come down from the existing 2000 series of parking debt that's carrying 6% coupons right now. And so we're looking to replace those 6% coupons, the rates, with potentially 1.5%, probably a little bit higher than 1.5%. I'd say conservatively closer to 2%, to leave a little room there, 2%. So there, I mean, it's a huge drop in the interest rate that's available to us. Now the key here is the parking revenue. The question is how best to refund those bonds. If you go with the parking revenue option, the rates would be again around that 2%, maybe even a little over 2%. But the geotaxable is about the same. If, this is not an option, but if we had the option to go to a geo tax exempt, it'd be lower yet, just to give you a feel for where the rates are. Either approach, whether you just decide you want to just stick with the parking revenue or the geotaxable, again, there's significant savings. In fact, millions of dollars. I'll have that analysis here on Monday of next week. But none of the covenants would be required under the geotaxable. So under this scenario, the parking debt at 6% that we have today is currently callable as of June 1st. And so we can replace that with lower interest rate debt at any time. Essentially, if we start the process now, we can replace it at any time. And so you can imagine, as the finance director, I'd rather do that sooner than later, because it's essentially we're keeping 6% debt on the books when we could be replacing it with something quite less than that. So the consideration in front of you would be to refinance the parking sometime in July, probably closing in August. We would need to do the hearings then at the next meeting, set the date of hearing, and actually hold in the second meeting in June. That would be the schedule that I would throw out to you.
So what's the
Scott,
total,
Go ahead.
Christine.
so what's the total debt that we have on the parking system right now?
Let's see, it's probably about 15 million.
Okay.
Yeah, and so we'd actually, and that's the beauty too, there's almost $2 million of reserve funds sitting there. We would cash that out, and the refunding would actually be lower, because you wouldn't need to establish a new reserve fund. So we would be replacing around 15 million of debt with around 13 million of debt. So that's another benefit. I mean, there's an awful lot of benefit to it.
If I could, Mr. Mayor, council members, the third bullet down, proposal to refinance parking revenue debt with geo-taxable debt. The taxable debt provides to you another advantage in the parking system, and that is that you can then lease parking to a business on a long-term basis. Right now, with tax-exempt financing, you're very restricted in that sense. You have to really make the parking available to a public user. So our ability to do long-term leases and our parking system has always been constrained by that fact. If you go taxable, then your ability to do long-term leases with a business, which you often have before you, but we're always coming back to you saying, well, we have a lot of constraints on that. This would free that up. And frankly, with the parking system in the state it's in right now, having the ability to have long-term leases with a business would be quite advantageous to us. So in addition to all the benefits that Scott's talked about, there is that one as well.
And again, the only reason this is even available to you is the reduction over time in the geo use for CIP projects. So you have two things working to your advantage. You have the geo capacity to issue these, but then you also have an interest rate environment that allows you to move over to the taxable scale and still pay incredibly low interest rates. That won't always be there. So in summary, looking to, again, propose that we change the policy to allow for enterprise funds to utilize that geo credit and therefore get the lower interest rates. Again, the current the current policy of 4% evaluation would remain the same. Not looking at changing that at this point. The debt paid by the taxes would remain the same. We're trying to target about a $4.10 tax rate on that. Again, this policy change would not impact that. And then the excess capacity available for any emergency situations is in excess of $110 million. And so there's quite a bit of flexibility there for unforeseen issues that may come up. Again, the time frame, the idea there would be to actually have that available to you at the next council meeting on June 11th. Which leads to the handout that I gave you, the one-page handout. You'll see some red on one side with the current debt policy. Actually, I might. So this is the write-up on the current debt policy. And then on the back side, you'll see what the proposal is, which cleans up some of the language, brings it more current, but does not change the 80% or the 4% of value figure that is currently in policy. The very last paragraph, G, talks about the revenue. That's the one I wanted to focus on. So prior to any issuance of debt that's associated with enterprise funds, I would come forward with a recommendation and an explanation, if you will, of what savings there would be, what covenants could be removed, and then if there's any impact on the credit ratings. I had spoken to, and you should know this as well, with our credit ratings being so good, I had spoken to the credit agencies of making sure that there wouldn't be an issue if we move forward with issuance of enterprise funds with the GO credit, and there was none. And in fact, they even mentioned it in one of the reports that was fine. So I think they'll be concerned when we get closer to that 80%, so we'll want to watch that again in 2016. But clearly for the next 3 years, if we do what's planned, that would not be a credit impact. It would not harm our AAA. I would never take us down that path. So this is the actual language. I think at the March meeting, somebody asked, they wanted to see what the actual proposal language would be. I'd ask that you look over this because this will be resubmitted for June 11th, if so desired, for the council meeting at that point. The other thing I want, go ahead.
Scott, looking at this language here, and you're talking about your conversations with the credit rating agencies, how does this, are other cities going this route? Is this unique for the city of Des Moines? And if other cities are going this route, what else are they doing? Is there anything else that they're doing that we should be discussing?
Yes, other communities are issuing enterprise fund debt as GO. What you'll find is it's the ones that have the ability and the capacity. So a lot of your communities, the first thing that I see when I see a revenue debt issuance from another community, my thought is, okay, if that's a smaller community, they probably don't have GO debt capacity. They probably don't have a choice. They probably have to issue their revenue. Because if you have the capacity available to you, you're always going to see that the GO tag, I shouldn't say always, but 99% of the time, the GO is going to get you a lower interest rate. And so, you know, every opportunity you could look at that as a potential savings. And again, the GO doesn't cover all the, or doesn't require all the covenants. And so yes, other cities are issuing a fair amount of GO debt that benefits their sanitary sewers, storm. Not too many others have parking. But, and again, the city has done that in the past. I believe there was an airport issuance and some others, but it's only at the point when there was capacity available and capacity expected in the near future. And that's that situation we find ourselves in because, again, less CIP debt has been issued over the last 5 or 6 years. And so that capacity has gone from 80% of utilization down to 64, where it's at today.
Does anybody else have any questions down here? Ellie, Skip, Bob? Bob?
I guess I have a comment that in summary of this, if we can issue these bonds at a lesser cost to the city, that it will not affect the taxpayers, but we're paying them back with enterprise funds.
That's correct. Yeah, the key there is the debt is being paid by the enterprise funds. And we've made accommodations for that. The rate increases and changes that have been put in place, we're anticipating additional debt being needing to pay. The other thing, if I could, Mayor, is just a handout, just to take with you as well. This is an example of what a recommendation would look like each time that I come forward with a debt issuance. It's the parking. It's the parking example that shows you, just for the numbers' sake. I know Councilman Coleman was asking about some samples, so this is what I would anticipate bringing forward each time, a side-by-side comparison of what revenue debt would look like as opposed to a GO. So take a look at that as well, and again in the June 11th meeting we can discuss further if need be. That's all. Thank you.
Brian, anything?
I actually do have a question. Either for you, Scott, or the city manager, or for Jeb or Bill. If we have this extra capacity and interest rates that are all-time low, likely not to remain that way over the next 10 years, are there projects that can be queued up so we can get them done and we expand the limits that we have? Are there projects that we can queue up to get done and be able to pay for them with these lower interest rates? And I'm just trying to think, we'll never see this again, an opportunity like this to...
Can I try? I mean, I think, Mr. Meyer, council members, you're making a really good point. You have very good numbers right now in terms of your ability to issue debt for all the reasons that Scott has said. If you issue GO debt that's tax supported, which is what it would be if you were to do a project that were not a utility, not a revenue bond kind of issue, then you're affecting the debt service levy, which is a property tax rate issue. So to the extent you're willing to deal with the property tax impact, then you are in a very advantageous position right now to issue more debt and take on more capital projects. It ultimately is a budgetary issue in the context of your CIP and the tax rate that you want to have affect the city.
Do we have projects? Can I hear from Bill?
Yeah.
I know we do. I'm just curious how many.
Mayor, County members of the council, Bill Stowe, Public Works. Mr. Meyer, we do have projects, as you know, several in your ward. At the end of the day, certainly reducing the transactional costs, the debt costs from these kind of projects is going to be helpful. I think we want to be careful as staff in presenting projects to you that we don't expand artificially just to meet the allowed budget. Reality is that we're in a constant struggle to prioritize. As I was sitting back there today, I had to say no to a neighborhood requested project involving stormwater. Certainly, reducing our debt costs is a significant benefit to both the storm and the sanitary sewer. We do have more projects out there that we typically would say no to, but I don't want to indicate to you that we are necessarily going to move forward with additional projects simply because you're reducing the debt cost. I think that's a fairly complicated issue when it comes to resolving what we still view as priorities. The transactional cost is reduced. I think that's good for ratepayers as opposed to taxpayers in this circumstance. But I don't think that necessarily means that I can point to 2 or 3 projects that we now would have on the table that we necessarily wouldn't have. An easy answer, Brian, and one that does come to mind, are relining projects, the projects that really go on because existing pipes fail, and we, without excavating, will reline existing pipes. Expanding that project is always a good idea, but rather pick the number, $600,000 that may or may not be available next year whenever this project change would occur, we would necessarily put into relining. I'm really just not comfortable telling you that because ultimately we have to rethink, and we're very much concerned, as I know you are, about continuing debt service obligations. Long term, we want to reduce our debt service obligations. This is certainly a step in reducing costs towards that, but simply spending the money because we have it is probably not the wisest course in the long term either. So a pretty ambiguous answer to your question. There are projects, but I don't think necessarily those projects will come forward because we're reducing our transactional costs.
I just didn't want to miss an opportunity to.
And I appreciate the real point you're making is a larger point also. Construction costs and interest costs are probably as favorable as we'll see. We have done some things. I know Mr. Moore and the mayor are on the WRA board. We've actually pushed some projects forward there with the idea that we have cheap and available money relative to what we'll see in a few years. But that doesn't necessarily carry for me into the storm and sanitary area where we have a lot more debt obligation.
Thanks.
All right. If there is nothing else, let's move ahead. And I think we're going to talk about Class C liquor license update.
Well, Phil's getting queued up. This concerns primarily an item that you have on the agenda tonight regarding a Class C liquor license request from Walgreens, and it's a fairly complicated issue. We know you're very concerned about it, so Phil has got a little presentation for you.
Laura, if you'd go to the PowerPoint first. Thank you. Good morning, Mayor and Council. Phil Delafield, Community Development Department, and as the City Manager updated you, a brief presentation about Class C liquor licenses this morning. What has precipitated this event is a recent application by Walgreens, and I don't want to single Walgreens out as far as their applications, but this is a new venture as far as these class of stores. So if you will think of, rather than thinking of Walgreens, think of this as a class of retailers. And there are other similar there are other similar retailers out there that are of a similar nature that may desire to begin selling liquor. And until we have our study complete, the question before you today is, should the moratorium be expanded to cover these other classes of retailers? So just by way of introduction, Walgreens currently has 9 applications pending for Class C liquor licenses. Each of these stores currently hold wine and beer permits, and they are classified as a general food or retail store, ranging in size from about 12,000 to approximately 23,000 square feet in gross area. And they range in sales floor area from about 9,500 to 14,000 square feet. These are the addresses. They're all over the city. Our existing moratorium covers new businesses and expansion of existing businesses that sell alcoholic liquor for off-premise consumption and operate as either a liquor store or a convenience store, gas station, limited food sales establishment, those up to 10,000 square feet, and limited retail establishments, those under 10,000 square feet. So as you can see from the summary, the Walgreens would be above those current threshold limits. Our moratorium is now through June 26th, and you have directed us to consider amendments to the current zoning regulations to cover these sorts of operations. Many of the options that we're looking at would potentially cover the Walgreens type of store and those of the similar class. Here you see an overview of the things that we're looking at right now. Those include separation distances between permits and license holders, separation distance increases from schools, parks, churches, daycares, a redefinition of the types of uses that the store must be separated from, and screening, for example. And then as you go down the list, sort of increasing regulatory environment based on the size. So general food and retail could be covered under these if you so choose. All of these then would require a conditional use permit from the Board of Adjustment. And then there's the option to tighten up those criteria for the conditional use permit. So the question before you this morning is, do you desire the moratorium to be expanded? Should it include general retail and food sales establishments? Or if you choose that it should not be expanded, then we would consider tonight the Walgreens Class C liquor license. If Walgreens or any similar class were to obtain their Class E license, they would be in the category of those grandfathered or legal non-conforming uses, so that future actions would not then touch them unless they let their license lapse. So the new zoning regulations may create new non-conforming uses that would not then be subject to the Board of Adjustment conditional use standards. Laura, if you want to put the map on. This map is a little difficult to read. There are a total of 57 existing uses right now with Class E licenses. The darker dots are those existing uses. The Walgreens are in the orange. If you can see the lighter dots, it's very difficult to see. As you can see, we have a distribution all over the city now, and again, the real question isn't Walgreens so much as if there was a retailer, Dollar General or Home Depot or Menards, they all fit into this category, just depending on the size. So the real question is, are those of concern to you, and if so, should we expand the moratorium? And that's the question.
What's interesting is as you look at the map, the number of locations that have multiple, where Walgreens is coming in.
So Phil, just to be clear about one of the key points, the current moratorium only applies to stores that have less than 10,000 square
10,000 square feet,
Correct.
or gas stations, C-stores, those sorts of operations that have been of major concern recently.
So the Walgreens are bigger than that, and therefore they don't come under the moratorium. So if the council wants the moratorium to apply, they have to amend the terms of the moratorium, which would be a...
Exactly so.
And so what would your recommendation be on amending the terms of the moratorium?
We could expand it so that it would essentially cover this category, and then there's a larger category yet, the larger stores above, I forget what the threshold is, 40,000? Thank you.
And so
40,000.
then based upon one of the slides that you had earlier in the PowerPoint, the criteria that you're reviewing and contemplating bringing forward to the city council would impact a Walgreens,
Correct.
a store,
Let's see.
based upon distance and,
Well, it could. I mean, those will be the choices that you have when we present the options. We envision that we will present you sort of a three-tiered approach, a light touch, a medium touch, and the heaviest touch, if you will. The light touch would target specific types of operations. Somewhere in the middle would be, not everything getting a conditional use, and then the most extreme touch would say everything that has Class E liquor license needs to have conditional use.
Brian?
Thanks, Mayor. And Phil, you and I touched on this on Friday about, I'm somewhat conflicted, but I can see advantages to expanding. However, the discussion that you and I had about the ability, if we allow these Class E's to diffuse and to spread them out, so they're not all over the place, but they're not, you have to go to the QT to get liquor, or you have to go somewhere else. So one thing I'm interested in, and this is just a general point about how do you get a Class E after the moratorium. What I'm looking at is there a way to, have we looked at what Oasis has done and their agreement that they've had, and I know that's not exactly the same thing, but some of the restrictions that they were allowed or that they were required to have, and I don't mean the dredge up 2007, although I love mobile food vendors, I will say that. But there is an attractive, my concern is loitering in the parking lot for some of these that are going to have liquor. And if you have a situation, just in general, having the discussion on after the moratorium, can we put restrictions on, items that would, or activities that would lead to loitering in the parking lots and that sort of thing, in terms of what Oasis did? I think they agreed not to have activities like that, like mobile vendors and that sort of thing. Is there a way to do that in general after the moratorium?
Mr. Meyer, the real challenge here is that zoning is a land use type of operation, and we can't cross over from land use into licensing issues. So where there are physical attributes of a class of users or uses, and you can generally apply those, then yes, we can do those sorts of things. That's where the separation and densities and those sorts of things come in. The similarities between the mobile vendors, we worked on a set of criteria that were necessary: hard surfaces, access to restrooms. But when you start talking about behaviors, then that becomes more licensing, and it gets into the realm of what constitutes a nuisance. That's what the conditional use is intended to evaluate. If they, as a class, or if a land user begins to show behaviors that they aren't able to manage the land use appropriately, then they can lose the conditional use through the nuisance process.
Thank you. That answered my question.
Mr. Moore?
I'm taking a look at this, and one area that really stands out is the East 29th or East 28th Court, East 30th area on East University, the potential for 4 e-liquor license in a block and a half. I was just wondering if we can use density as a consideration on this.
Yes. Physical separation, those sorts of things can come into play. That's one of the options we're looking at.
Thank you.
Ellie, Bob?
I guess in terms of expanding the moratorium, I don't necessarily have a preference. I mean, I don't see this as being a huge problem for our city. But at the same time, I think we may want to consider adding it. I mean, this is 9 stores, but it could easily be 25 or 30 on our next agenda. But I don't necessarily see this as a huge issue the same way that we're having with some of the convenience stores and stuff. So I don't have a strong preference either way on this particular one.
I certainly have a strong preference. I think we need to expand this to, so it doesn't escalate like it could happen to us. I think we ought to go through the process with Phil and that about distances and so forth and see what we can do on that. So I do have a strong preference to expand this.
Brian?
I just had one question. What's the time frame are we looking at for actually having an ordinance? So how much longer in the moratorium?
Moratorium runs through June 26th. We would have something to you at that time.
Christine?
I do have a strong preference, and I'd like to see us include this. You know, no disrespect intended to Walgreens. They're a pharmacy store. They're not a liquor store. You talked about Menards. They're a lumber store. They're not a liquor store. And I just see this really expanding. I'd love to know what the numbers are now throughout the state that we've had with the number of Class C liquor licenses. I'd be willing to guess it's continued to go way up. I'd also like to have us sit down with the director of the Alcoholic Beverage Commission, because after some of the earlier discussion we had, and it was in the paper, they wanted us to come before them so that they could potentially, you know, work with us this legislative session. So I just have real concerns. I just see it not stopping, but just continuing to spread.
Anything else?
So am I to understand you'd like to see the moratorium expanded this evening? Is that a clear direction?
I'll support it.
Yes. Okay.
Certainly, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep. All right. I guess we'll open up for public comment. Is there anybody in the audience who is for the good of the cause or benefit of the public want to say anything? Seeing none, thank you all for attending. We'll see you this evening. Thanks. We're adjourned.